Do the Zionists have any historical claim to the lands of Israel?
Of course, but I would not say that the Jewish claim, or the Zionist claim, is the only claim or the main claim. I say that it is a claim among many others. Certainly the Arabs have a much greater claim because they've had a longer history of inhabitants, of actual residents in Palestine, than the Jews did. If you look at the history of Palestine, there's been some quite interesting work done by biblical archaeologists. You'll see that the period of actual Israelite, as it was called in the Old Testament, dominance in Palestine amounts to about 200 to 250 years. But there were Moabites, there were Jebusites, there were Canaanites, there were Philistines, there were many other people in Palestine at the time and before and after. And to isolate one of them and say that's the real owner of the land, I mean, that is fundamentalism. Because the only way you could back it up is say, well, God gave it to us. Yes, but I mean, Christians think that God gave it to them, and Muslims think that God gave it to them. I mean, that's not a rational argument. So I think the people who have a history of residence in Palestine for a certain amount of time, including the Jews, yes, and of course the Arabs, have a claim. But, and this is very important, I don't think any claim, I don't care whether it's given by God or by the emperor, nobody has a claim that overrides all the others and entitles that person with that so-called claim to drive people out. I mean, that's the point.
The situation concerning Israel, Palestine, and the occupied territories is so complex, stacked with geopolitical, historical, religious, and cultural layers that it is almost preposterous to suggest that it could be condensed into 5 points. However, we live in a world with a rapidly declining attention span, and the global community's concern and solidarity is the only way to its peaceful resolution. These are 5 largely unknown truths about Israel, Palestine, and the occupied territories. Number 1. Most scholars agree that the beginning of today's struggle was the displacement of over 700,000 Palestinian Arabs by the Israeli military in 1948, which the Palestinians call the Nakba, meaning catastrophe in Arabic.
The early Zionists understood quite correctly, without knowing the details, that Jews were not going to do very well in Europe. As it modernized the nation state, where were Jews going to fit in? And they, in general, thought they weren't going to fit in, which in turn was actually true. They didn't understand that a Holocaust would happen. But the desire to settle in the 20th century in the land and a little bit before, but then accelerating, had to do partly with the sense that Europe was going to close down for Jews, and this attachment to the land historically, the idea that Jews needed to get out of the situation of being a minority, of being specialized, say, in money lending and banking, and also being poor and being on the outskirts of this and that. And crystallized the pre-Holocaust years, the rise of the Nazis and fascism in Europe, where settlements started to accelerate, and then with the Holocaust, and then the displaced Jews who survived the Holocaust, and the creation of the state.
What would happen if you built a refuge for a persecuted people in a place where another people already lived? In the next few minutes, you'll learn why this moral quandary is at the root of the struggle between Israelis and Palestinians, and what you can do to help achieve a just peace for everyone in the region. First, there are a couple of things it's helpful to understand. 1, many Jews fled harsh persecution in anti-Semitic Europe, especially the Nazi Holocaust. Zionists encouraged massive immigration to historic Palestine, at that time a British colony, where Jews had an age-old connection and where small Jewish communities had long existed among larger groups of indigenous peoples. But when the UN offered the Jewish immigrants the majority of the land for a new state called Israel, for the indigenous Palestinians who lived there, it was a massive destruction of life. They rejected the UN's partition plan, and several Arab states invaded the new state of Israel. Israeli forces essentially erased over 400 Palestinian villages and towns. By the end of the fighting, Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine. And when 750,000 Palestinians who fled or were expelled during fighting tried to return to their homes where the new state now stood, they were permanently barred by the Israeli government.
There was the Balfour Declaration, but Al-Nakba was the biggest catastrophe. I mean, that's the translation. It was the biggest event that I like to think about.
My parents are refugees. They happened to be outside of Palestine when their village Arabi was occupied.
Here was World War II, here was the Holocaust, and you know, the good white Christian nations did not welcome the suffering Jews. And we could have saved lots of people, and we did not.
I was born in a Palestinian refugee camp in Palestine. So I was born in a refugee tent that was pitched under an olive tree in Jalazon refugee camp. So for me, there were no choices or no options to choose from. I was committed.
Overnight, they became refugees. They weren't allowed to go back home.
It's just convenient for various people to say, oh, put them in Israel. And, oh, what happens to the native people? Well, we've never been concerned about native people, so you work it out.
It is the best jumping off point to talk about, because when you're trying to talk to somebody who's not familiar with the cause, you want to bring up just how violent the past was. When they say, oh, you know, there's two sides to every story, but when you displace 700,000 Palestinians, are there two sides really when they're living in diaspora and refugee camps for the last 70 years? I mean, we just passed the 70th anniversary of Al-Nakba. So that's where I like to start.
My family came from Lid. My neighbors came from Jaffa, from Al-Abbasiyah, Beit Nabala. All these are towns that were demolished by Israelis in 1948. So everyone had the same story, and all they wanted to do is really go back to their homes and to their properties that they have been prevented from returning to. There were no choices. There was one option, which is to support the people that you're part of, and they were prosecuted since 1948. My family was forced at gunpoint with probably less than 5 minutes to get out of their home. My family used to live in Lid, or Lud, as the Israelis call it right now, in July of 1948. July is important because that was after the establishment of the State of Israel, which means Israel, this is where Israeli forces, and they're responsible for removing people. And when they got kicked out of the house, yes, they took their keys with them, and they were forced to walk for about 2 days in the sun with bullets flying over their heads. They had to sleep under figs and olive trees. There is our house in Lid still exists, it's still there. There's a family that lives there. We visited them, and they are there. They are using our house, occupying it. We have 2 groves, orange groves in Palestine that my family owns. We're not allowed to go there. We're not allowed to touch them. We're not allowed to touch our house. My father is a Palestinian Muslim who lived in Lud and had Jewish friends and neighbors. Actually, he had a Jewish business partner. His name is Cohen. My father used to call him Kohen. And Cohen was a younger man than my father, and one day he wanted to get married, right? So he came to my father and asked him to lend him 10 Palestinian dinars before the wedding. My father said, Inshallah. So then later on, Cohen came to my father and said, you know, Hussein, my father, I want to get married. Am I going to get this money and get married or not? Am I going to get married or not? My father said yes, and he gave the money. Although he has been forced at gunpoint out of his house with his 4 little children and his wife, my father never spoke ill of any of his Jewish friends. He always spoke positively about them because they were his neighbors and his friends. And that is one example that you can map onto all the Palestinians that I have known in my life. People have not spoken out in an anti-Semitic terms. This is the summary of the solution is to make my family whole. That sums up the whole problem. for people who think that people ran away or no. My family exists, available, want to go back to their house. They've been prevented for 7 years from going back to their home and actually living peacefully in their home.
Since the first Intifada, nearly 7 times as many Palestinians have been killed by Israelis than Israelis killed by Palestinians. And this disparity is growing over time.
We are not well served by being asked the question of when did it start? I mean, just look at the situation. Look at, the armed militia firing on nonviolent demonstrators, Israeli armed forces and, Palestinians, and observe, make a statement. This is wrong.
Mary, I can look at anyone here in their eyes and say, Israel is doing its level best not to kill anyone who is not involved. It's very important to know who is responsible here, because
Is it not the responsibility of the people pulling the trigger? That's normally how you hold people responsible for someone being killed.
Well, how do you define pulling the trigger? If you have the Hamas people...
A man with a gun aims at a child from 150 meters away and shoots him in the head.
What about Palestinian terrorists who are hiding behind innocent people who are launching
Well, it's a
rockets?
simple question.
مش شرط يكون الإسعاف بس للراجل، لا برضه للمرأة، لأنه في كتير حالات بتلاقي إصابات نساء، مين بدي يتعامل معهم؟ صح ممكن الإسعاف، بس برضه يعني إحنا إلنا دور كبير في هذا الإشي. إحنا هدفنا واحد، هو بس إنقاذ وإخلاع، ونوصل رسالة للعالم إنه إحنا بدون سلاح قادرين نعمل كل إشي. احنا هاي الخيمة هي الخيمة اليومية بتختص، احنا كمتطوعين احنا كل يوم بنكون موجودين في هذا المكان. هذا حب انتمائنا للوطن، يعني هذا عمل انساني ما بدنا عليه مقابل، احنا بدنا نقدر تعبنا الله بس، مش مستعد يعني ما بدنا مقابل من اي حدا، لا رواتب ولا توظيف بدناش. كثير سألوا بابا بنتك هاي طب ما بتاخذ راتب هيك، حكى لهم انا بنتي بفتخر فيها انها بتقدم اشي انساني لابناء وطني، يعني كمان بنت، وخصوصي احنا المرأة عنا منتقدة كتير في المجتمع، بس المجتمع لازم يتقبلنا غصبا عنه، لو بدوش يتقبلنا بإرادته بيتقبلنا غصبا عنه، لأن احنا عنا قوة أكتر من أي راجل. القوة اللي احنا بنمتلكها، القوة اللي استرجلت فيها كأول مسعفة في الأسبوع الأول، بتحدى ألاقيها عند أي شخص يعني.
15,000 wounded. How many of them were either members of Hamas/terrorists?
I do not know. I know that from the 62 on the 14th of May, 50 were Hamas by their own admission.
No,
on the
we
others,
don't know that because there hasn't been an investigation.
The facts are...
You got their Hamas membership forms from their bodies? What's the facts?
The facts are that Hamas leadership, sometimes at gunpoint, are sending those poor Hamas, those poor Gazan people to the borders. Now,
where's the evidence for
do
that?
They have in the borders?
The UN doesn't say that. Human rights groups don't say that.
Well,
let's come back to the issue of the shootings here. Even if they were all members of Hamas, even if all 15,000 people are, you do realize that under international law and basic morality, you can't shoot people for being members of a group, no matter what group it is. You can only shoot them when they pose an imminent threat to you. Were 15,000 people posing an imminent threat to Israeli snipers?
Yes, they were. Yes, they were.
What Israel does in Gaza, bombarding entire cities, killing civilians indiscriminately, razing people's homes, barging in the middle of the night and kidnapping their children.
All of the residents I talked to had horror stories of life under brutal occupation. Sometimes Israeli soldiers themselves dissent, even in the face of very severe repercussions. One of whom is Eran Efrati, who was stationed in Hebron during his time in the Israeli army. Since leaving the military after years as a combat soldier, Efrati has dedicated his life to documenting Israeli war crimes and fighting the apartheid system.
I feel like for the first time in my life, the boundaries between good and bad that I learned as a kid and obviously I learned that I'm on the good side, I was broken. I felt like I am the terrorist. And my job was literally to scare people so they cannot think about acting against the Israeli settlers or the Israeli military. That was actually our defined mission, to make sure that to instill fear in the hearts of Palestinians in Hebron. And that's exactly what we did.
Israeli helicopter gunships deliberately fired a missile into a crowd of civilians last night, killing 7 Palestinians and wounding 70 more.
I witnessed Israeli violence, extreme violence against non-violent protesters. The weapons they used, the provocations they used, the way they used the weapons without provocation also. It was very scary, and what was scary in Standing Rock is that I was seeing the same kind of violence.
אין כזה דבר אזרחי מבחינתנו. מבחינתנו, אנחנו מזהים מישהו, אנחנו פשוט יורים בו. הלהבות, כמו בסרטים, הכל תמרות עשן, שכונה מפורקת, בתים על הרצפה, וכאילו, אנשים חיו שם.
Military service in Israel is for most just another fact of life. You hit the age of 18 and it's compulsory to join the army. But throughout Israeli history, there has also been a handful of people who refuse to serve for ideological reasons, conscientious objectors. They may apply for exemption from army service, but not everyone gets it. And some end up whiling away their would-be army days in prison. 19-year-old Ta'ir Kamener has now broken the record for the longest imprisonment of a woman refusing the draft.
There are currently 3 conscientious objectors who are being held in Israeli military prison, and 2 of them have been temporarily released, and right now they're at Ta'ir Kamener's home in Tel Aviv.
Ta'ir, perhaps ironically, came to the decision that she wouldn't serve in the army when she spent a year volunteering with youth in Sderot, a southern Israeli town located on the front lines of any confrontation with Gaza.
In this continuing of the war, we are creating generations of hate.
I'm against violence and I wouldn't join any army. I applied for an exemption on this basis, but I was denied it. So I decided to refuse service and to go to prison. I didn't try to get out of service in another way, because I wanted my voice to be heard.
Dialogue is the ultimate goal of these girls, about the Israeli occupation and about the very act of joining the army.
It's absurd that 18-year-old kids have to join such a violent body that is obligatory.
Both refusers also opined that the army is political. Ta'ir's father, who himself did serve in the army, as did one of his other daughters, fully agrees with this assessment and is proud of Ta'ir's path.
If there will be 2,000 Ta'irs, the government would change its mind. The government will change its position, because it means there are thousands of people who are no longer willing to participate in maintaining the occupation.
The balance of terror and violence is overwhelmingly against the Palestinians, not surprisingly, given the balance of forces. And that's even true, that's true right to the present. I mean, for decades, Israel was able to run the West Bank virtually with no forces, as Morris and others point out, because the population was so passive. While they were being humiliated, beaten, tortured, land stolen, and so on, just as I quoted. Finally, there was a reaction. And it's interesting to see the U.S. reaction to it. In the first month of the Intifada, this one, October 2000, in the first month of the Intifada, 74 Palestinians were killed, 4 Israelis were killed. It's all in the occupied territories. The Israeli army, according to its own records, fired 1 million bullets in the first day, which disgusted the generals when they learned about it. Israel, the first few days of the Intifada, was using U.S. helicopters, they don't make them, U.S. helicopters to attack civilian complexes, apartment houses and so on, killing and wounding dozens of people. And the U.S. did respond to that. Clinton responded by sending the biggest shipment of military helicopters in a decade to Israel.
The main problem in the US is the very distorted view that's presented by mainstream media, and a lot of people, studies have shown that a lot of Americans think that Israel is the victim and more Israelis are getting killed, and they're the ones who are it's like they're the ones who are under occupation. When an Israeli is killed, you hear about it in the media a lot. There's a lot of attention to that person. He or she is humanized. We know their name, their age, what they were doing with their lives, what their dreams were. We get so much information about that one Israeli life, which is great. Every life matters. But when Palestinians are killed, it's a very different treatment. You just hear about 5 Palestinians were killed in one sentence, and that's pretty much the end of it. You don't really hear a lot about it. So I think the way mainstream media has been humanizing Israelis and dehumanizing Palestinians, I think this is a big source of the misrepresentation and the misperceptions.
There have been horrific Palestinian terrorist attacks, and I use that word very specifically to mean what terrorism means, which is attacks on civilians for a political purpose.
Anger in Israel today at last night's suicide bomb in Tel Aviv, which killed 4 and wounded around 50.
Those are horrific attacks, which should be condemned. They are violations of international law, period. But the problem is, Israeli violence is assumed to be legitimate because it's always self-defense.
Some of the people who have been killed are said to be civilians. In fact, 2 of them are said to be little girls. But the Israeli military says they try to the best of their knowledge to make sure whoever they are striking was a known militant.
I don't know of any army that would do anything differently if you had to protect your border against people who say, we're going to destroy you and we're going to flood into your country. You try other means. You try all sorts of means. You try non-lethal means, and they don't work, so you're left with bad choices. It's a bad deal. You try and you go for below the knee, and sometimes it doesn't work. And unfortunately, these things are avoidable. If Hamas had not pushed them there, then nothing would happen. Hamas holds responsibility for doing this, and they're deliberately doing it.
In 1967, Israel and the neighboring Arab states fought another war. When it ended, Israel had seized the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and both Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel was now occupying the Palestinian territories, including all of Jerusalem and its holy sites. This left Israel responsible for governing the Palestinians, a people it had fought for decades. In 1978, Israel and Egypt signed the U.S.-brokered Camp David Accords. Shortly after that, Israel gave Sinai back to Egypt as part of the peace treaty. At the time, this was hugely controversial in the Arab world. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was assassinated in part because of outrage against it. But it marked the beginning of the end of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. Over the next few decades, the other Arab states gradually made peace with Israel, even if they never signed formal peace treaties. But Israel's military was still occupying the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza, and this is when the conflict became an Israeli-Palestinian struggle. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had formed in the 1960s to seek a Palestinian state, fought against Israel, including through acts of terrorism. Initially, the PLO claimed all of what had been British Palestine, meaning it wanted to end the state of Israel entirely. Fighting between Israel and the PLO went on for years, even including a 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon to kick the group out of Beirut.
The stillness of the ceasefire in southern Lebanon was shattered today by the sound of guns, bombs, and planes.
The PLO later said it would accept dividing the land between Israel and Palestine, but the conflict continued. As all of this was happening, something dramatic was changing in the Israel-occupied Palestinian territories. Israelis were moving in. These people are called settlers, and they made their homes in the West Bank and Gaza, whether Palestinians wanted them or not. Some moved for religious reasons, some because they want to claim the land for Israel, some just because the housing is cheap, and often subsidized by the Israeli government. Some settlements are cities with thousands of people, Others are small communities deep into the West Bank.
If you've always felt a deep yearning for Jerusalem, now is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity not only to stand within its gates, but also to build the home of your dreams there.
Settlers are followed by soldiers to guard them, and the growing settlements force Palestinians off of their land and divide communities. Short term, they make the occupation much more painful for Palestinians. Long term, by dividing up Palestinian land, they make it much more difficult for the Palestinians to ever have an independent state. Today, there are several 100,000 settlers in occupied territory, even though the international community considers them illegal. By the late 1980s, Palestinian frustration exploded into the Intifada, which is the Arabic word for uprising. It began with mostly protests and boycotts, but soon became violent. Israel responded with heavy force. A couple hundred Israelis, over 1,000 Palestinians died in the First Intifada. Around the same time, a group of Palestinians in Gaza, who considered the PLO too secular, too compromise-minded, created Hamas, a violent extremist group dedicated to Israel's destruction. By the early 1990s, it's clear that Israelis and Palestinians have to make peace. The leaders from both sides signed the Oslo Accords. This is meant to be the big first step toward Israel maybe someday withdrawing from the Palestinian territories and allowing an independent Palestine. The Oslo Accords established the Palestinian Authority, allowing Palestinians a little bit of freedom to govern themselves in certain areas. Hardliners on both sides opposed the Oslo Accords. Members of Hamas launched suicide bombings to try to sabotage the process. The Israeli right protests peace talks with ralliers calling Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin a traitor and a Nazi. Not long after Rabin signs the second round of Oslo Accords, a far-right Israeli shoots him to death in Tel Aviv. But this violence showed how extremists on both sides can use violence to derail peace, keep a permanent conflict going as they seek the other side's total destruction. That's a dynamic that's been around ever since.
I spent a lot of time on my radio program going over Hamas's charter, what it says. It wants to obliterate Israel. It wants to destroy the Jews. It is a sick, twisted, perverted ideology, a religion that has been hijacked by radicals.
Muhammad is dead. He left his daughters behind. Israel, by virtue of it being Jewish and of having a Jewish population, defies Islam and the Muslims. Let the eyes of the cowards not fall asleep.
We can agree that Hamas charter is horrible. But now let's look at the Hamas charter. The Hamas charter was written by maybe half a dozen people in 1988 at a moment of an extreme Israeli attack on Gaza. It has no status. They've repeated over and over again that it doesn't apply anymore. And if you're interested in charters, why keep to that? Take the governing party in Israel, Likud. It grew out of Cherut. That's its ideological center. Its position, never changed, is that the land of Israel, that the entire land of Israel belongs to the Jews. That includes today's Jordan, okay? In fact, the old slogan was both sides of the Jordan. That's ours and this is too. They've never changed that. So that's their charter. Did anybody pay attention to it?
The Palestinians today are faced with a zero-sum game. They're not given any options to return to their homes or to be compensated for their properties or their voice to be heard. They're expected to surrender and accept this oppression that's been going on for 70 years or over than that. With that kind of choices, it puts things in a situation where it looks like a continuous cycle of violence.
Both sides are engaging in aerial bombardment, but one side appears to be better at it. Most Hamas rockets are neutralized by Israel's Iron Dome technology, and Israeli citizens can even now download a warning app.
You'll get it on your phone, and you'll know exactly what city is being targeted and when it's being targeted.
Well, that's the $2.99 version. The free version... In the free version, you have to watch a clip of Transformers 4, and then... if you can get it off the screen, they'll tell you where the bomb is going. So Israelis seem to have a high-tech smartphone alert system. How are the Gazans notified?
Basically, a small mortar explosion on the roof of a building, which serves as an Israeli warning of an upcoming airstrike.
So the Israeli military warns Gaza residents of imminent bombing with a smaller warning bombing.
Hamas are not my friends. I don't like what they do. But they've been doing not much. What they've been doing is what I described. I didn't have time to go through the pattern, but I'll repeat it. You can find it. Starting in November 2005, an agreement was reached between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, then not Hamas. Israel completely rejected it, and Hamas lived up to it, not a single rocket. Then came the January election, and Israel intensified its attack with U.S. support. After that, there are repeated attacks, Israeli attacks, and ceasefires agreements. Every ceasefire agreement is approximately like what I read. What happens is Israel completely dismisses and disregards it, and maintains the siege in violation of the ceasefire, increases the violence. Hamas lives up to it, and Israel officially accepts that agrees to that, until some escalation of Israeli violence leads to a Hamas reaction, and then another episode of mowing the lawn. That's been going on since November 2005. Hamas is not a nice organization. They do a lot of rotten things. That's for the Palestinians to worry about. But it has nothing to do with us. If we were supporting Hamas, nothing, zero. If we were supporting Hamas, it would be our problem. But we're not. And what they do is for Palestinians to deal with. What we deal with is what we are doing, which is supporting massive criminal operations all over the region, blocking peace. That's for us to be concerned about.
Number 3, the Israeli settlements are illegal under international law.
In fact, they still hold on to land, the West Bank and Gaza, that they conquered in the war in 1967. Since then, Israel has built Jewish settlements throughout the occupied West Bank, building Jewish-only cities and supplying them with infrastructure like roads and army camps, schools, and even a college. Military occupations are meant to be temporary, but after 40-plus years, this one looks permanent and entirely unjust. In the West Bank, Israeli Jewish settlers and Palestinians live on the same land, but must live under two completely separate and unequal systems of Israeli law. The Jewish settlers dominate the natural resources, including water and agricultural land, and they're backed by the Israeli army. To maintain the occupation, Israel has demolished thousands of Palestinian homes and orchards, confiscated Palestinian land, bombed a captive civilian population in Gaza, and punished resistance with raids, arrests, and assassinations, all to gain maximum land, while making life so difficult for Palestinians that they will either leave or be too afraid to resist.
The homes were given to settlers that came from Europe and Eastern Europe and other places. These are people that were handed over homes like they were candy, and they don't ask themselves where did they come from, what happened to the people that were living there. That's the first question they should ask themselves.
It's obviously not been a peace process, it's been an annexation process. So the peace process, at least the current phase of it is said to have been initiated at Oslo in 1993. And then you look at the results. There were about 250,000 settlers in the occupied Palestinian territories in September 1993. The figure is now 20 years later, now it's about 550,000. So judging the process by the results, there hasn't been a peace process, there's been an annexation process.
We had our Jewish Voice for Peace and Liberation Passover Seder recently, and the hosting rabbi had been in Ramallah recently, I believe. And he talked about being on a rooftop of a Palestinian home where there were the tanks storing the water, and that's because water gets turned on once a week for a certain number of hours and you store it. There could be a collective punishment issued in which the next week you wouldn't get it at all. So you are very careful with your water. And you can see over in the Jewish settlements, the green grass and the swimming pools, and you know that people can freely take showers, etc.
I served in the Israeli military as a major in a commando unit. I lost friends. There's no one wants peace more than me, but peace will be achieved by strength, not by carving out our tiny country and handing it over to our enemies.
You're not carving out your own country, you're withdrawing from occupied territories, which everyone in the world, including Israel's own Supreme Court, regards as occupied territory. That's the problem. You can't carve out stuff that's not your own.
Mahdi, I guess what you need to do is go back and change the Bible. You need to change the narrative of the Bible because it's all there. And I assume
is Israel a theocracy?
All Muslims,
is Israel now a theocracy?
and
Is
Jews,
it a religious state?
I assume.
Why are you quoting the Bible to me? I'm quoting the Supreme
Christians,
Court
Muslims,
of
and
your
Jews.
country. Hold on, the Supreme Court of your country.
Let me finish.
Let me just put the quote of the Supreme Court to you and then you respond.
You're finding...
The Judea and Samaria areas are held by the state of Israel in belligerent occupation. That is the view of the Supreme Court of your country. Are you saying the Bible trumps your Supreme Court? Is Israel now a theocracy?
Let me finish. Billions of Muslims and Christians believe in the Bible. I assume, including yourself, I don't know. If you want to say that our land does not belong to us, I suggest you go change the Bible first, come back and then show me a new Bible that says that the land of Israel doesn't belong to Jews.
Okay, so
now, if it's very convenient for you to sort of shove that away, that's fine.
I'm not shoving anyway. You've made your religious education point.
You're right.
Yeah.
I wouldn't take these claims seriously. If we weren't in an academic discussion, I would call them idiotic. My Jewish theology of liberations begins with the Holocaust, not with the Bible. And if there's any claim, if we call this a claim, for the creation of the state of Israel, we would have to talk about Europe, not ancient Europe, but modern Europe, the Nazi years, and the Holocaust. And then the question would be, if Jews need empowerment, which I believe Jews do need to be empowered, not necessarily in a state, but the amount of anti-Jewishness in history and the amount of ambivalence toward Jews, which is carried throughout the world by Christianity and Islam, not simply a condemning of Jews, but an ambivalence about Jews. Jews are fantastic and they're evil and everything in between, and it's always. So there's a reason that Jews sought their own power and not to be dependent on others, which I agree with. However, that led to displacement and a profound injustice, and that continues now, toward Palestinians. So we have to, politically speaking, navigate this need for Jewish empowerment with the cost of that empowerment, which is the central feature of my Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation. What do we do? I don't want to go back as a Jew or for Jews to a disempowered situation. I also do not want, and we should not want, to have our empowerment over against others, including the Palestinian people.
Very early on, I understood that the rights that the Jewish settlers have are not the rights that the Palestinians have. I understood that I cannot touch a Jewish settler if he is attacking a Palestinian. The best I can do is call a local police department to come handle it, like I would do at home in Jerusalem. So these Jewish settlers that live in Hebron are living under the same rights that I live in Jerusalem, but the Palestinian next to them, next house over, next building over, sometimes next apartment over, lives under my rule, my military rule. And I can do whatever I want with him. I can take his home as a temporary base for a few hours to a few days to a few weeks. I can decide that I'm arresting the people of the house and tying them up to the fence of my base. if we will get an order to demolish their home.
اسمي عهد باسم محمد التميمي، عمري 14 سنة. شفت جندي برفع في أخوي محمد وبخبط فيه بالأرض. مسكت إيد أخوي المكسورة عشان ما يصيرش فيها نسبة الكسور أعلى. ولا حدا يعني أصر علي إنه لازم أنزل بالمسيرة عشان أقاوم. بجاوب للناس اللي بيحكوا إنه ما فيش أمل، إنه طول ما في جيل زي جيلنا قادر إنه يثبت للاحتلال إنه هو أقوى منه، بضل يقاوم، أكيد في أمل إننا نتحرر.
Number 4. Adjusted for inflation, the U.S. has given Israel over $233 billion since 1949, and it's only going up.
Clarifying the truth and clarifying and letting people know about the enormous amount of oppression that is actually enabled by the U.S. I mean, without the U.S. support, this would not be happening. So the main message is to American people is you need to know about this because you are responsible. It is your tax dollars and your government. And if this is a democracy, then, you know, I guess we have a responsibility here as Americans to make sure our government is acting ethically and morally and using our tax dollars in ways that are not causing destruction in other parts of the world.
Particularly as an American Jew who the larger American Jewish community has been very complicit in Israel's ongoing occupation of Palestinian land and treatment towards their civilian population, both in Israel, like Palestinian Israelis, as well as those Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza. And so I feel particularly called to do something to end the violence and to create a just peace.
You've been very critical of Bibi Netanyahu and the Israeli government. We spend a few $1 billion on aid to Israel. Would you ever consider using that aid as leverage to get the Israeli government to act differently?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we are giving large sums of money. Look, let me back it up before the tweets start flowing in. I lived in Israel. Yeah. Actually, I worked in a kibbutz for a number of months. I have family in Israel. I am Jewish. I am not anti-Israel. Okay, I believe that the people of Israel have absolutely the right to live in peace, independence, and security. End of discussion. That is what I fervently believe. But I think what has happened is, in recent years under Netanyahu, you have an extreme right-wing government with many racist tendencies. The role of the United States, and this is not easy, you know, I believe me, Clinton tried it, Obama tried it, Jimmy Carter tried it. This is not easy stuff.
He worked harder than our forefathers did in Egypt building the pyramids.
You obviously were very successful in bringing peace with Israel and Egypt. Can any deal be done that doesn't involve sitting across a table with Hamas?
I've met several times with Hamas leadership, and I think they are willing to accept Israel to exist peacefully within the 67 borders or some modification of those borders. But the first step has to be to bring Hamas and Fatah together so they can have another honest election. That is a major premise, and I think the 67 borders between the two with some modifications will lead to a two-state solution.
It's a culminating event of prior training that we have received, being training with the IDF soldiers here in Israel. I think working alongside the other militaries It's important because they develop a bond with these Israel soldiers, the IDF. I enjoy working alongside the the IDF. I feel that I enjoy it just because they're bringing us in. It's something that we haven't done. It's something I've never done in my 12, 13 years of being in the Marine Corps. So being able to come in and learn something new and see someone else's point of view and their threats and how it differs from how we operate and our ideas and our threats, I think it's opening, it's educational.
Israel's continual expansion, which is state-planned, which every sector of Israeli society participates in, is wrong. It needs to be stopped. But the interests of America, of Israel, of many of the Arab countries, is not for it to be stopped, just the opposite.
Is to try to finally bring peace to the Middle East and to treat the Palestinian people with the kind of respect and dignity they deserve. Our policy cannot just be pro-Israel, pro-Israel, pro-Israel. It has got to be pro-region, working with all of the people, all of the countries in that area.
Washington will give Tel Aviv $38 billion in military aid. A 10-year pact is the biggest pledge of U.S. military assistance ever made to any foreign party. A new aid package for the first time will include money for Israel's missile systems. It calls for at least $3.8 billion a year in aid. That's up from $3.1 billion under the current pact, which will expire in 2018.
We have the Lehigh amendments, which say we cannot give military aid to countries that are abusing human rights. And if this were South America, and somebody would be outraged and we would withhold arms. But we give $8 million a day. It's all military, and we don't look. So instead of saying, oh, but they have a right to be there, and look at what we're doing and make a statement about what we're doing, and search your soul. What is the right thing to do?
Number 5. Criticizing or resisting the Israeli government and the Israeli military is not anti-Semitic. Both my parents are refugees of Palestine. They came from different villages. They immigrated to Gaza, and then from Gaza, their parents took them to Kuwait and Jordan. And growing up, I grew up in a very small town, Belton, Texas, where the topic of being Palestinian was synonymous with being anti-Semitic. So a lot of the times I pretended I was Egyptian.
When you make a criticism of U.S. foreign policy or a position taken by the president or by Congress, you are criticizing political actions. And as an informed citizen of the world, you have a right to make those statements about you have a responsibility to make them about your own country. And you could make it about any country. And when you observe Israel and see it doing things and you make statements that say, the Israeli policy of blah, blah, blah doesn't resonate with me, isn't fair, isn't just, that is not being anti-Semitic, because it is not discriminating or perpetuating violence against Jews for being Jews. It's saying, hey, you have a country, you made a law, you have done something, and we don't think it's right. So when you hurl the accusation of anti-Semitism at people, you are trying to silence them. And that's what it's about.
There is a certain inhibition for Palestinians and for those who are in solidarity with Palestinians, which is that whenever we want to talk about the nature of Zionism, or for example, the nature of the State of Israel as it is currently constituted, we run into this criticism that we're either anti-Semitic, or that we're not respecting international law, or that we're calling for the annihilation of the Israeli people when we're not. And we want to be able to have a legitimate debate about the principles that underpin the State of Israel and why they have caused so much suffering for the Palestinians.
The strongest way is how you spend your money. There's the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions. If higher ups like the Prime Minister of Canada is talking about BDS and maybe we shouldn't do BDS, it's working. It's scaring people, and that's why we need to keep going. Boycotts work.
Many of the young people here today are on the front lines of the battle to oppose the alarming boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement known as BDS. I've been sounding the alarm for a while now. As I wrote last year in a letter to the heads of major American Jewish organizations, we have to be united in fighting back against BDS.
Vice President Biden, Joe, we've been personal friends for almost 3 decades. Can you believe it's been that long?
No, you're getting older, baby. I don't know.
You remain younger all the time.
At the same time that, for example, Governor Cuomo ordered a boycott or barred a boycott of Israel, 2 months earlier, he ordered his state employees to boycott North Carolina in protest of an anti-LGBT law that state had adopted. So in Andrew Cuomo's worldview and the worldview of Texas, you're allowed to boycott other American states and harm American businesses and be employed. You're just not allowed to harm or boycott this one foreign country, Israel. You can boycott Canada or Russia or anybody else. It's just special protection for Israel that not even American businesses enjoy. That's what makes it so shocking.
Given the understanding and the severity of the conflict, it's easy to feel overwhelmed and that we're powerless, but actually there is a lot that we can do. And supporting the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement of Israel is one thing that ordinary people can do. The official Palestinian civil society coalition of groups that has called for BDS of Israel.
BDS critics always say there's a double standard. What about all the other countries who are guilty of human rights violations? Syria, Iran, Russia, North Korea, what about them? Now, not only is this pure whataboutism, it's deflection and evasion of the worst sort, but just look at the facts. Syria, Iran, Russia, North Korea are all, rightly or wrongly, subject to sanctions of some shape or form.
I would see myself as a typical Israeli, Sabra if you want. I was born there in 1945 and then grew up with the state. And I was studying law in 1967 when the war broke. Until then, I would say I was a normal, regular Israeli. And once the war broke, I realized that we, the students, the people, were misled before the war to believe that it is a war for peace. Israel didn't think of creating peace, and I found myself having to decide whether my humanity prevails when I saw what happened to the Palestinians in the occupied territories, or my Israeli loyalty would prevail. And I chose my humanity.
طلع هذا منظر هيك الناس تخش منه. عندك شباك او 2 فتحات. كم واحد؟ ولا 8 اللي جوا. 12 جوا. وبيفتحوا كم واحد؟ حاليا يمكن فاتحين 2 في الساعة هذه. كمان ساعة بيفتحوا كمان بصير 3 4. كم عامل تقريبا هون بيجي؟ والله بيطلعوا الفوات من هنا. الفوات يعني. من وين بيجوا هذول العمال؟ من جميع المناطق، من يطا، السموع، الخليل، الظهرية، من جميع المناطق. كلها من كل المناطق. من يطا. هاي 2 الصبح طلعت. وهاي مستنى. أي ساعة شغلكم جوا بيبدأ؟ بنبلش على 6. عشان إن رمضان بلش على الساعة 6. كل يوم بصير هيك؟ كل يوم هيك، يوم هيك. يوم.
While the Universal Declaration for Human Rights says that all people are, quote, born free and equal in dignity and rights, the Israeli nation-state continues to restrict freedom and undermine equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel, as well as those in the West Bank and Gaza. While human rights promises the right to life, liberty, and security of person, Palestinians continue to live under the threat of random violence by Israeli military and police. Disproportionate violence within the West Bank and Gaza, unprompted violence in the face of peaceful protest, and misdirected violence by an Israeli state that systematically fails to distinguish between civilians and combatants.
And when you go there and you're walking through a place like Isawiyah, and I'm watching an 80-year-old man have to pull down his pants at a checkpoint. When I'm watching children go through checkpoints, the ritual humiliation of being a child walking through checkpoints. When I'm watching women have to go through forests and bushes to go around checkpoints, 80 and 90-year-old women to sell vegetables in East Jerusalem, and then they get fined and they lose all their money. When I'm watching children getting beaten with nightsticks, when I'm watching stop and frisk on Via Dolorosa, the very walkway where Jesus occupied the 7 stations of the cross, when I'm watching that happen, and I'm also watching children being stopped and frisked, which is outside the tradition of any religion. When I'm watching people being killed and maimed, and I'm watching this, there's no way I can see that and not speak out against it. Right.
And again, this doesn't mean that harm doesn't happen to Jewish people. This isn't an Olympics. We can talk about both at the same time. And I understand that there's a deep pain and a deep frustration and a deep memory of the Holocaust. And so we must always make sure that people are safe, that minority populations are not vulnerable. I agree with that 1,000%. That's why I say we don't have to choose between Jewish security and Palestinian freedom. And the honest answer is, and people don't want to say this, until there is complete freedom for everybody, nobody's safe.
Just listen. Listening is the most important solidarity you can accomplish. I learned a lot about anti-Blackness in the United States just by following Black revolutionaries on Twitter or on Facebook and just listening, not trying to put myself in the conversation, but follow. If you want to learn more about the Palestinian struggle, listen to some Palestinian lectures, follow some Palestinians online, and just see what they have to say.
Palestinians have been displaced. They have had their society shattered. They have had to live under military occupation. Their lands and lives are today systematically torn apart. There are no two ways about it, I believe, which is not to say that we must simply overlook the tragic history of the Jews. On the contrary, I would always want to say that as a Palestinian, I should make my case to defenders of Israel on the basis of taking full account of, making due acknowledgement of the history of discrimination against Jews. That kind of policy should never, ever be visited on anyone for any reason at all, least of all by Jews, in the name of their safety and independence.
And there are various campaigns, one of which is Jewish Voice for Peace has initiated kind of on its own. It's called Deadly Exchange, where we're trying to end the police exchange programs between U.S. police departments and the IDF forces. So we have various couple Jewish organizations and police departments that are paying for these officers to go get trained by the IDF so that they can come and over-police and over-criminalize.
What you see when you see oppression in one part of the world, and it's okay, and we are sponsoring it and supporting it, the US is, gradually this will find its way towards us.
Ferguson, Missouri is trying to return to normal.
Nationally, police significantly increased their arsenals after the September 11th attacks as the front line in the war on terror.
And like I said, I saw that in Standing Rock, and I think it's really spreading to, and in Ferguson, similar oppression against the black communities and against Native Americans and against Hispanics. And I think this is why it's important to connect all our struggles as has been happening. I'm very happy to see it happening, and those bonds need to get stronger, and we need to fight together as one, because the struggle in the end is all very similar, and we need to fight it together.
What impressed me so much was that especially black people, but also many white people, including Jewish people, stood up and in support of the idea that Palestinians also deserve to be recognized for their human rights. It is not possible to believe in human rights, but to exclude a given population.
As a human being, I believe in universal human rights and that we should use whatever power and privilege and influence we have to advocate for a world where all people are treated equally and fairly and justly.
The label of anti-Semitism has been overused and abused, and I think more people are realizing that it's ridiculous. I mean, Palestinian resistance and supporting Palestine is about supporting human rights. Opposing Israel is about opposing state oppression. It's got nothing to do with religion.
I know that, you know, I have a huge Jewish constituency, and, you know, every time I meet with them, they share stories of safety and sanctuary that they would love for the people of Israel. And most of the time when we're having the conversation, you know, there is no actual like relative that they speak of, and there is still lots of emotions that comes through because it's family, right? Like my children still speak of Somalia with passion and compassion, even though they don't have a family member there. But we never really allow space for the stories of Palestinians seeking safety and sanctuary to be uplifted. The dehumanization and the silencing of a particular pain and suffering of people should not be okay and normal. And you can't be in the practice of humanizing and uplifting the suffering of one if you're not willing to do that for everyone. And so...
Furthermore, a lot of Jews are becoming anti-Zionist and speaking up against Israel, and they're definitely not anti-Semitic.
Thousands of Israelis marched through Tel Aviv on Saturday, urging Prime Minister...
Israel should recognize the state of Palestine. Israel should make peace with the Palestinians. Israel should accept the 67 borders as the basis of peace.
How can we begin to move forward with compassion and justice with others, some of whom don't want it? Many of them don't want it, or they're invested in injustice, or they get used to being treated unjustly. It's a very complicated situation, but that doesn't excuse us. We need to call ourselves, but also the institutions around us, to account.
Representative Tlaib wrote a letter to Israel appealing their decision to ban them, saying, please give me this chance to see my grandmother. It might be the last chance I have. And that she agreed in that letter, which she signed, to abide by Israeli restrictions and not promote the boycott while she was on her trip. The Interior Minister of Israel approved that request. He granted her access after originally they took it away. But then something interesting happened. That same day, Representative Tlaib turned down that offer, the offer that she had initiated, and said she will not be going to Israel under those conditions which she originally agreed to. So I asked her, I said, why did you make that request? Once it was granted, why did you change your position? And she spoke about her grandmother. She said at 3 o'clock in the morning, she spoke to her grandmother in the Palestinian territory and with the rest of her family, and that they decided as a family that they would not support her going to Israel under these conditions where she would have to restrict her freedom of speech. She said that her grandmother called her a bird. She said that her grandmother said, you are my bird, you are free, you need to fly, and you can't come into this cage to be here with me. She got emotional as she recounted that story, and she explained that that was the reason why she changed course, why even though Israel eventually came around and granted her request, her letter was convincing to the Interior Minister that she denied the request to go in the end.
The delegation would have seen firsthand why walls are destructive, not productive. They could have asked the people in Bethlehem how walls cut people off away from economic opportunities, from a way to live, and do psychological damage that lasts forever. All I can do as her granddaughter is help humanize her and the Palestinian people's plight. I know that when we can finally see them as deserving of human dignity, everyone who lives there will be able to live in peace.
We cannot be free until we are all free. So the Palestinian orgs like to bridge the gap between apartheid in South Africa, what's going on in Syria, all kinds of indigenous struggles.
We identify with the PLO because just like ourselves, they are fighting for the right of self-determination.
Welcome in Palestine.
Thank you. I feel welcome here. I feel at home here. So, which is your house?
It's here.
Which is your house?
My house was there.
No. I say still is your house. Yeah, well. It's a political issue. I don't think there's any doubt about that. It's an attempt by Israel to take over East Jerusalem, which is part of Palestine. And they've been living here 55 years. 3 families living here legally 55 years, has 17 members in the family. They've all been forced out of their homes, and they've been taken over by Israeli settlers. And of course, the only appeal they have legally is to the Israeli court system. And I'm not condemning anybody, but it's obviously a matter of injustice and human rights.
The conflict is the real enemy. The Palestinian people, the Israeli people, we are not enemies. We have the same interest, which is to receive our right for self-determination, freedom, dignity.
Women for the first time are raising their voice and asking for peace because they need it. They need peace for the future of their own country. And I'm supportive of them because I do believe that they have a very strong voice inside the Israeli society.
עשינו שלום עם מצרים, יש לנו סוג של שלום עם ירדן. ביקרתי בירדן, ביקרתי במצרים, הם גם מוזמנים לבוא לפה, למה לא? אירופה עברה מלחמות הרבה יותר קשות מהסכסוך הפלסטיני, מלחמת העולם הראשונה, מלחמת העולם השנייה, ומה? היום הם לא חיים ביחד? למה הצרפתים והגרמנים או הצרפתים והאנגלים היו ידידים טובים? לא? אני איתה. איתי.
لا خلينا نبلش نروح الصوت هردوشه تبغى بوبنا
كيف حالك؟ كيف حالك يا بنتي؟ كيف حالك؟
يهودي بيصاب بشخص فلسطيني يعني الكل بيستغرب وقالت ناس ما بتصدق في ناس شفتها إن كل اليهود مش ملاح مش الكل واضح للناس فيهم الملاح وفيهم العاطل وعند العرب فيهم الملاح وفيهم العاطل.
Amir en Amjad zijn elkaars spiegelbeeld. Ze steken beide de grens over naar de ander en laten een ander beeld zien.
I'm taking care of Amjad, and Amjad actually, he's taking care of me because if he say Amir, the Israeli is my friend, he is my brother, he gives me the right to live in my country, Israel.
بقرا الصورة اللي عندهم عنا يقرا الصورة اللي عنا عنهم.
I hear this bloody word every day. The Palestinians are our enemy, and it's not true. He's not my enemy. Manar is not my enemy. Why they say it every day in Facebook and our government? Shukran jaziran. Occupation is take people freedom. I want people to be freedom. I don't know how to do that. I can't give them their freedom. I can't give them back their land, their villages. I can make their present a little bit better.
That it reminds me so much of what used to happen in South Africa, where people were evicted from their homes, and their homes were taken over by whites. And you would see someone say, "You see that house? That used to be my home, but they are no longer allowed to be there." But the point is, that happened, and now freedom has come to South Africa, and we want to say to you that justice will prevail in your own situation as it has prevailed in other situations, and that you should not give up hope that you will be able to live securely in your homeland.
This film is not an indictment of the Jewish people. Palestinian rights are Jewish rights. This film is a criticism of the Israeli government, the Israeli military, and the American government. This is a call to action. To our Jewish allies, join us in the movement to end the decades-long persecution of the Palestinian people. Join Jewish Voice for Peace. Join If Not Now. Research BDS and make your own decision. Read up, speak out, and may we all live in peace, inshallah. Thank you.